Wheel of morality, turn, turn, turn. Tell us the lesson that we should learn. Moral number 1. And the moral of today's story is... vote early and vote often.
How profound.
Across 2021, as vaccines began to be released to the public in response to the COVID pandemic, and people began to get their jabs at increasing frequency, so too was something else released to the public: the viral vaccine social media video.
Masks? They're totally beast. So slide that into your DMs and twitch it.
These videos, often musicals, are considered by some scholars to be the most inseparable form of media yet known to man. Designed to encourage others to get vaccinated, and many have accrued a ton of views, but often not probably in a way that the creators would have wanted, as the videos have been mocked incessantly online due to being, well, cringe.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer?
It's clear that a lot of work and effort went into many of these musical numbers, which sometimes involve some seemingly high production values, so considering the effort involved, does this kind of social media persuasive messaging actually work when it comes in the form of a public service type announcement? Similarly, another persuasive music video gained notoriety across the internet, produced by the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir, because it featured the phrase, "We'll convert your children."
We'll convert your children. We'll make them tolerant and fair.
Despite the fact that the persuasive message of the video was to encourage people to be more accepting, the messaging itself, much as with the vaccine musicals, got lost in the cringe of the package the message was served in. And with particular concerns about the packages of Californian queer men rising, given some other issues, the Gay Men's Choir was forced to remove their video due to the backlash, albeit only for a time, surely only because everyone recognized what a pale imitation the video itself was of its classic inspiration.
State of Florida has asked us to disclose our sexual crimes to you. We were bad, but now we're good. Moving into your neighborhood.
But surely the point of these videos, whatever their message is to go viral, and to encourage some societal change secondly. But how effective are viral social media messages at influencing the behaviors and beliefs of those exposed to them? Today, let's look at the effect of viral public service announcement style videos on our views, beliefs, and behaviors. But first, since we're going to be talking about a lot of embarrassing attempts at going viral to gain attention, let me first tell you about this video sponsor to help you cut out the chaff and some of the cringe, but not the humor from your daily news, and that's The Morning Brew. The Morning Brew is a daily newsletter that's absolutely free to sign up for to fill you in on what's happening in the world, be it in finance, technology, culture, etc. Each article on The Morning Brew is written with your time in mind and takes just a few minutes to read without any of the extra fluff. For example, I just learned that Biden called for half of all US cars to be electric, hybrids, or hydrogen-powered by 2030, which, as the Brew notes, is a bit like telling McDonald's and Chick-fil-A to convert half of their sales to veggie burgers in just 9 years. The Brew also offers short daily quizzes about recent news to check how much you've learned, and even holds weekly meme battles. For your daily sip of piping hot headlines with a spoonful of wit, check out The Morning Brew. Linked down below, and sign up for their newsletter to become smarter in just 5 minutes. Designed to entertain, and all, again, absolutely free. And it only takes 15 seconds to sign up for. So now that we've got our brew good to go, let's begin by looking at the effectiveness of public service advertisements and social messaging. Social media is, well, obviously social, and by nature of its sociality will be influenced by social psychology. That is, our perception of things on social media will likely be affected by how we think others are also perceiving that thing at the same time, because we're all engaging with content together. That's why Twitter was basically made unusable for a few days after news broke that Chris Chan, did what he allegedly did, and the entire website was so overwhelmed by the news that some weird internet personality may have banged his own mom that it outtrended the Olympics, even disrupting communication in China. This isn't just the case with social media, but mass media in general, as when we watch a commercial on TV, there's a perception that others around the country or even the world may have also been exposed to that messaging. They may even be watching it at the same time that we are. Public service announcements, then, are of course included under this umbrella. To understand how perception that others are being exposed to the same persuasive messages that we ourselves have been, and therefore may be affected by that messaging, Gunther et al. 2006 developed the presumed influence hypothesis, of which there were 3 aspects. First, we make inferences about whether or not others have been exposed to media based on our own exposure to it, presumed exposure. Second, when we believe others have been exposed to the media, we also presume that said media has influenced them in some way, presumed influence. Third, the presumed influence on others may cause us to align our own attitudes towards a piece of media with what we think is the general attitude of others towards that media. Influence of presumed influence. That is, it's not so much really that the messages themselves are necessarily that persuasive, but rather the belief that others are persuaded by the message that can be persuasive. We are persuaded because we think others are being persuaded. A kind of inferred peer pressure. It's a perpetual cycle wherein I think you have been persuaded by a media message, meanwhile you are simultaneously thinking that I have been persuaded by that exact same message, when in reality both of us thought the message was stupid. Yet the perception that other people believe something, in and of itself, is persuasive. Many of the viral videos designed to elicit some behavioral or attitudinal change in society could be described as modern-day public service announcements, otherwise known as PSAs, a type of socio-political messaging which has been ridiculed for decades before the advent of social media.
Hey kids, stay off ferries in Malaysia. The boat.
At least in America, because in Britain it was a bit of a different story. Wow, the 70s were a rough time. Anyway, the public ridicule of PSAs, you would think, would be a big warning sign for these groups attempting to produce these viral videos with similar social messaging. Just because your message contains a song and a dance routine, when it's selling social messaging, doesn't inherently make it less similar to This Is Your Brain on Drugs, or more similar to Rent, or to this.
Don't be stupid, be a smarty. Come and join the Nazi party.
But unlike the infamous 1987 and 1997 This Is Your Brain on Drugs ad campaigns, both of which were widely criticized for a variety of reasons, including this particular criticism from New York Times writer Frank Rich, who in 1998 described the 97 version as an, quote, elegantly shot display of high-concept Madison Avenue creativity. The woman looks like Winona Ryder, she's wearing a tight tank top, there are no visible track marks on her junky thin arms, and the kitchen representing her drug-induced hell is Echt Pottery Barn, if not Williams-Sonoma. Far from discouraging teenagers from drug use, our anti-heroin heroine, sexy when she gets mad, may inspire some of them to seek out a vixen like her for a date. Not exactly my criticism, Frank Rich, but you do you. The point is, people really disliked these ad campaigns. They disliked them both times they tried it. Although, were the 97 version to come out today, perhaps the response would be quite different.
Ain't no daddy issues that I won't even bother. She say I kill a cat like I'm Luca Magnotta.
Art hoes never change, as apparently neither do PSAs. Because despite the criticism, they didn't stop, and another commercial was made in 2016. But despite all these attempts from PSA creators, there was never a lot of good evidence that this type of messaging was actually effective. There is some correlational evidence, sure, as there was a decline from 55% to 47% in national prevalence of marijuana in US youths between 1990 and 2007, as seen in data from Johnston, Bachman, and O'Malley 2010, but as of yet, there's no real evidence that that decrease could be attributed to PSAs rather than, say, the fact that during that period of time, many states were actively decriminalizing, if not fully legalizing, medical and even recreational marijuana. So, do we have evidence that PSAs work? Well, no, not really. A meta-analysis of more than 300 research papers on the effectiveness of 48 PSA ad campaigns from Snyder and Hamilton 2002 produced a mean correlational effect of only 0.09. The most powerful campaigns were those that emphasized legal enforcement, such as seatbelt ads. But even across those campaigns, the mean effect was 0.17. Of course, in the UK, that kind of increase could be due alone to the presence of Jimmy Savile in a seatbelt PSA, being less of a suggestion and more of a threat.
And it can be very unfunny.
A ridiculous ad, of course, because we all know Jimmy would never let an egg box end up empty. Campaigns that contained new information were also more effective than those that reiterated previous messages. Ads that focused on advertising some public service were also slightly more effective than those that did not direct consumers towards specific services. Interestingly, role model and celebrity inclusion in a campaign was associated with decreased efficacy, although perhaps not Savile's seatbelt ad, which aged like fine wine due to his threatening aura. Ironic considering Jimmy's views on things getting better with age. As we might expect, campaigns with wider reach were more effective at altering beliefs and behaviors than were smaller campaigns. There was also no significant difference in how effective campaigns were based on how long the campaign ran. The important takeaway of this analysis of PSAs from before widespread access to the internet was available, so mostly television, radio, and billboard campaigns, is that they were fairly ineffective. The results of this analysis are such that the average number of people who changed their behaviors in response to any type of PSA was 9%. When removing the ads that specifically discussed legality and only discussed the social persuasion campaigns, however, this effect decreased to only 5% of the general populace being influenced. And 5% change is so negligible statistically as to potentially be attributable to random error. In other words, PSAs don't do much to change behaviors, or at least they didn't in a time before the internet became ubiquitous. But that's obviously not the world we live in anymore now, is it? Perhaps the precise reason that these campaigns were so ineffective is because in 1997 the US government passed Bill HR 4328, which required PSAs to focus on highlighting healthy behaviors rather than focusing on risky or dangerous behaviors. The modern social media attempts at virality in semi-PSA format are in line with this trend, to focus on positive rather than negative, and there's some good reasons for that beyond a bill passed by the US government, since usually the government doesn't have good reasons to do anything.
Lauren was supposed to do a paper on why government matters. This is what she wrote.
It doesn't. Well said.
But social science does occasionally have good reasons to believe things, and in this case, namely, it's terror management and mortality salience. Particularly when it comes to campaigns focusing on public health, terror management is always going to be a concern. Mortality salience refers to how much we are thinking about death at any given point in time, and is something that most of us really don't enjoy and instead seek to avoid. Teenage goth girls and Edgar Allan Poe excluded, I suppose. Terror management is a theory that proposes that, simply put, people don't like to be afraid, and that includes fear of death. So they will try to avoid any and all information that makes them feel afraid or ignore frightening information because it creates psychological distress, and that discomfort can actually lead to boomerang effects, as seen in a study from Wong and Dunn, 2013, in the context of binge drinking. In this study, college students' binge drinking activity and their degree of self-esteem related to binge drinking were first assessed. Binge drinking self-esteem was measured with items such as, quote, binge drinking makes me feel good about myself, and subjects were also asked about their general beliefs about the social acceptability of binge drinking. Participants were then shown a PSA that either emphasized the potential deadliness of binge drinking or emphasized other negative outcomes, while the control group watched, this. The researchers didn't specify which binge drinking ad was used, so I'll just assume it's this.
And if he dies, Ghost George will vote me forever.
Grab a chip. Want a chip?
You know I can't grab your ghost chips.
Go away.
You also know that one of these two scholars just thought that Darth Vader ad was adorable and wanted to throw it into their study about freaking binge drinking and death thought accessibility, just to lighten the mood. Anyway, after watching one of these 3 videos, subjects were then asked about their mortality salience, again thinking about death, their attitudes towards binge drinking, their intentions to binge drink in the future, and their perceived susceptibility of the negative possible outcomes of binge drinking. Those exposed to the PSA with high mortality salience, who also viewed binge drinking as part of their sense of self-esteem, were far more positive towards binge drinking than non-self-esteem based binge drinkers, who watched the mortality salient ad, and both binge drinkers and non-binge drinkers who watched the ad that did not increase death thought accessibility. There was no significant difference between those high or low in binge drinking self-esteem and their attitudes towards binge drinking when they watched the Volkswagen ad. That is, PSAs can reduce positive beliefs regarding harmful behaviors, but they are less likely to do so when they threaten the viewer with thoughts of mortality salience, which alcohol can often do.
Honestly, if the cops come back, there will be, honestly, blood drawn. No, seriously. I will honestly damage a human being's body. I will draw blood from a human.
The effects of PSAs on behavior, however, were a little bit different. Specifically, those who watched the Volkswagen ad were more likely to say that they intended to binge drink in the future, regardless of their degree of self-esteem related to the action, while those who watched the non-mortality salient ad were more amicable to the idea of not binging in the future. However, those whose self-esteem was related to binge drinking and watched the mortality salient scary ad were less likely to say that they would avoid binge drinking. High binge drinking self-esteem was also most strongly related to intentions to avoid similar messages about binge drinking when they watched the mortality salient PSA and viewed the ad more negatively than any other group. Those who liked binge drinking did not like seeing a negative PSA about the dangers of binge drinking. These results are indicative that using fear as a way of trying to convince people to change their behaviors isn't particularly effective for those who view that behavior as part of their sense of identity or self, and actually, instead, makes them less susceptible to persuasive messages. That's just one study, but there is a plethora of research which is indicative that scaring people with PSAs is not particularly effective. But a lot of what goes on in PSAs is not just educating people about their health or legal ramifications, but instead emphasizing social stigma of behaviors, and as such, in a similar study to the one that we just looked at, Martins and Kamens, 2010, examined the effects of PSAs on smoking behavior, one of which emphasized the health effects of smoking, and the other which emphasized the social effects of smoking. Subjects' general level of self-esteem were measured, and then subjects watched one of two anti-smoking videos. They were then asked about their intentions to quit smoking, both short and long-term. The PSAs which emphasized the health effects did not result in significantly disparate results in intentions to quit smoking for short or long-term periods of time, regardless of participant self-esteem related to being a smoker. Comparatively, threat of ostracization had a major impact on those whose self-esteem was tied to smoking in the short term, while for long-term smoking, both those who had high and low self-esteem associated with smoking were equally likely to say that they would try to quit. In other words, people who viewed themselves as smokers, when they watched a PSA that emphasized the negative social effects of smoking, were the most likely to say that they would change their behaviors long-term compared to PSAs that emphasized the negative health effects of smoking. Then again, is it really a big surprise that a lot of smokers care more about looking cool than about their health? Interestingly, respondents also reported that they felt smoking was considerably more harmful to their health when they saw the social PSA rather than the health-oriented PSA. That is, they actually thought cigarettes were worse for you when not reminded about the health effects of smoking. If you're trying to make a social message campaign designed to change behaviors, then focusing on the negative health effects that may occur if one does not comply is probably less effective than focusing on social exclusion if one does not comply. And it does seem that a lot of PSAs regarding the jab are concerned with the social aspect more than the health aspect. And again, from the perspective of terror management, that makes a lot of sense. That's smart PSA construction. People don't want to think about their own mortality, even if it's really cringe. People don't want to think about their own mortality, so having them instead think about being a pariah is more effective at inducing behavioral change. So, we've looked at smoking, but what about the hard stuff? And by hard stuff, of course, I'm referring to the real shit.
You see, after just snorting one of these single bags of Yorkshire tea, your sparrow can increase its speeds by up to 50%, ladies and gentlemen.
In all seriousness though, Werb 2011, conducted a meta-analysis examining the effectiveness of anti-illicit drug PSAs over 20 years and 11 studies, some of which were observational and others randomized control. Just to be clear, by illicit drugs, marijuana was included in these studies, so again, actually how hard this stuff is kind of up for you to decide. They found that most studies of both types reported non-significant results. 3 random control studies and 1 observational study actually found that anti-illicit drug PSAs may have had negative effects on illicit drug use. That is, exposure to these kinds of PSAs may actually have encouraged people to try illicit drugs as a form of psychological reactance. When you tell people what they can't do, they will often be drawn towards that exact behavior as a method of restoring independence. A similar study from Fishbein et al. 2003 specifically examined this potential boomerang effect, in that it's possible for PSAs to actually cause more harm than good, as we keep kind of seeing. Children between grades 5 and 10 were surveyed in this study and exposed to 30 different PSAs, with each group of 5 students watching 6 different ads about drug use. Group 1 saw ads that focused on negative effects of mostly marijuana and inhalants. Group 2 watched ads that promoted developing self-esteem outside of drug use and peer pressure. Group 3 saw ads that emphasized, quote, just saying no. And finally, groups 4 and 5 viewed PSAs about the negative outcomes of drugs, but focused more on methamphetamine and heroin.
Nah mate, heroin and heroin, completely different box of frogs. Heroin's fucking worse, mate.
Students were asked how effective and realistic the PSAs were, if they had any negative or positive emotional reactions to the ads, how much they learned from the videos, the perceived dangers of drugs, how harmful drugs are, and how normal doing drugs was. The most effective PSAs were those that focused on negative outcomes, for hard and illicit drugs like meth and heroin, and presented their information in a dramatic format, while the least effective ads were those that focused on marijuana use and the just say no or self-efficacy type messages. Positive emotions were generally associated with lower efficacy of the PSA, while negative emotions were more effective. depicting negative outcomes with dramatic representations was also more useful. The most powerful variables were learning, realism, negative emotions, followed by the drug in question being covered in the PSA. The PSAs targeting marijuana use were particularly ineffective, as the 5 PSAs with significant negative effects on reducing intention to use drugs, and may have actually increased intentions, were those that targeted marijuana. The takeaway from these 2 studies on illicit drugs seems to indicate that PSAs are not very effective, but while the negativity and fear that these ads often emphasize may be the best way to make an anti-illicit drug ad more effective, these PSAs are attempting to discourage illegal behavior. How do you instead craft a PSA to encourage a behavior? In regards to the PSAs or social messaging seen in a lot of viral videos, they're not trying to get people to stop doing something, they're instead trying to change behaviors, be it related to the coup for converting children. And one thing these messages may have in common, very much unlike anti-drug PSAs, is that they emphasize the behavior that they are advocating is the social norm. After all, in terms of the San Francisco Gay Men's Choir and their message, take that same message to Saudi Arabia and witness how disparate of a response there would be. Always awkward when you're on the 48th floor and you get informed that you're going to be walking home. This is particularly persuasive because no one wants to be ostracized. But has that tactic worked in other areas of persuasion? Gunther et al. 2006 examined this question in the context of anti-smoking PSAs and the perception that those PSAs were persuasive to other members of the community. The researchers questioned 6th and 7th graders on whether or not they had seen an anti-smoking PSA in the last month and how frequently they had been exposed to these kinds of messages, as well as how often they had seen an actor or actors smoking. They were also asked how often they believed their peers had been exposed to anti-smoking PSAs or smoking in media, and how many kids around their own age they believed smoked in general. If you think that's really young for kids to be smoking, well, me too, but remember, there was a time when Americans expected kids to smoke.
CIA with guns for hire, mountain yards around a fire. Napalm makes that fire higher. Napalm sticks to kids.
Look, this video's a little bit dark, much like people exposed to napalm. Just accept it. The majority of students, 65%, said they'd never tried smoking, and of those, 74% said they would never consider smoking. Those exposed to media that depicted an actor or character smoking were more likely to say that they might try smoking, while there was no effect on smoking behavior for anti-smoking PSAs for individual students. In terms of the perception of other students, subjects believed their peers were exposed to more anti-smoking PSAs than they themselves had been exposed. However, they believed the power of exposure to pro-smoking media was far more influential on their peers than exposure to anti-smoking media. Further, their perception of prevalence of support for or against smoking influenced how susceptible the individual student would be towards becoming a smoker, and this effect was stronger than the student's personal attitude towards smoking. In other words, how likely students believed their peers were to be influenced by pro-smoking messages made individual students potentially more prone themselves to become smokers. In the total model, the only effect of anti-smoking PSAs for students was that greater exposure led to a belief that more of their peers had also been exposed to anti-smoking PSAs, and through that mediated perception, exposure of peers to anti-smoking PSAs was minorly negatively related to perceptions of the prevalence of smoking across one's peer group, but not related to a decrease in smoking behavior. Of all the variables assessed, the weakest predictor of smoking were exposure to anti-smoking PSAs and the perception that peers had been exposed to anti-smoking PSAs as well. The latter was actually a negative, albeit non-significant relationship. While the most potent variables in predicting if a young person would start smoking was not even personal beliefs about smoking, but instead beliefs that smoking was normative amongst one's peers. PSAs don't appear to be very efficacious once again, but what does appear to work is peer pressure. Even if it doesn't actually exist, just the perception that something is normative makes it more likely to change behavior than watching a public service message by far. If you want to convince someone to do something then, they probably have to already think it's something that their peers are doing. And in that sense, viral videos have a pretty big advantage over traditional media, in that every video is accompanied by a view count, and depending on how things go, sometimes even a like to dislike ratio, all of which provides more information about the normalcy of the behavior being promoted. If all of your friends are getting vaccinated, and then you see a video about vaccinations, well, then that video is going to be far more persuasive on your own opinions than it would be alone. So, although a lot of the studies we've looked at so far seem to make it pretty clear that the efficacy of PSAs isn't necessarily that robust, these have predominantly been traditional campaigns, usually coming from some presumably authoritative source. Instead, social media campaigns are mostly made by individuals or smaller groups of individuals rather than corporations or governments. So how does social media uniquely influence these kinds of more grassroots campaigns? Cho Shen and Peng, 2020, proposed that how influential social media PSAs might be would be related to the perception that others are also being influenced by that media message. First, subjects were asked about their own tobacco use. Then, some were told to imagine that they were surfing channels on television and came across 2 different clips, while others were told to imagine they were browsing YouTube while coming across these same 2 clips. One clip was a commercial for electronic cigarettes, while the other was a PSA warning of the dangers associated with e-cigs. For the YouTube videos, the number of views was manipulated, so that the view count was either 10, 100, 100,000, or 1 million. Respondents were then asked how influential they believed these clips to be, how many people they believed had been exposed to the clips, how realistic the clips were, and how persuasive the clips might be at changing attitudes and behaviors regarding e-cigs. Regarding the perceived amount of exposure to these videos, interestingly, subjects believed that the PSA that aired on mass mainstream media was always slightly less likely to have been seen by others than the ads on YouTube, even when the YouTube video had 10 views. However, this difference only reached statistical significance when the YouTube video was depicted as having over 1 million views. This was contrary to the researchers' directional hypothesis, in that people apparently think YouTube videos reach far more people than PSAs that air on mainstream television channels. The same trend was the case for the perceived influence of the PSA on others, in that even videos with 10 views were seen as more influential, but this difference again only reached statistical significance in videos with over 1 million views. No wonder the mainstream media is seemingly so afraid of YouTube. As views on the YouTube videos increased, so too did perceptions that others had been exposed to the video, and so too did perceptions that the videos were more realistic, and the more realistic, the more subjects identified with the video. Although, I'm not sure who finds this realistic, let alone identifies with it.
It's vaccination day! It's vaccination day! It's vaccination day!
But realism alone was not related to belief others had also been exposed to the video, while identification was unrelated to the number of views. There was no indirect effect of realism on presumed influence via presumed exposure, but there was a direct effect of realism on the perception that others were influenced by the YouTube video. To summarize these findings then, first of all, people think that YouTube videos with 1 million views have a wider reach and greater ability to influence the public than a PSA airing on a major television network. The number of views a video has and identification with the video or its message were both directly related to belief that others had also seen the video, and perceived exposure was related to belief that others had been influenced by the video. In other words, these attempts at virality on YouTube, even if they don't really go viral, are seen by viewers as being more successful than television PSAs at not just catching the attention of the general public, but also at being more influential at changing the general public's beliefs or behaviors. The very idea that others are being influenced may then influence us, but how? White and Dillon 2000 examined that very topic in relation to PSAs to understand how beliefs that others were being persuaded by a PSA's message would affect our own acceptance of the message. In this experiment, 2 groups of students were shown the same PSA about the social benefits of signing up to be an organ donor. I haven't been able to find the specific PSA, but it's described as, quote,
"A well-dressed man speaking to the camera about the rewarding outcomes of human organ and tissue donation. The speaker explained that his brother had been killed in an automobile accident, but that the family had fortunately arranged for an organ donation, turning the tragedy into one of hope for someone still living. The PSA's attempt to persuade the viewer was indirect. Production qualities were simple, employing no emotion-laden video."
So a fairly neutral but pro-social advertisement. Before watching the video, one group of subjects were told that the PSA had aired in a different part of the country and had been very successful at convincing others to become organ donors, while the other group similarly read that the ad had aired elsewhere in the country, but had not been effective at increasing signups for organ donation. Subjects then answered questions about how persuasive they believed the ad to be, and how persuasive it might be for others. There was very little difference between groups in how persuasive the PSA's message itself was on belief. Pretty much everyone said that being an organ donor was a good thing. However, subjects reported that the spokesperson, message content, and production qualities were all more effective on persuading themselves than it likely was for others. In this case, when referring to a pro-social behavior like organ donation, this is indicative, perhaps, that we tend to kind of think that we're better than others by being convinced by a compelling pro-social PSA to do a good thing. A little bit of an Anna Kasparian effect, perhaps.
Am I saying that I'm better than you? I guess I'm going a little further than you are. Yeah, I'm better than you.
Despite the fact that subjects generally felt that they were more affected by this pro-social message in general, when told that others were not persuaded by the PSA, they were less persuaded by the message than when they had been told the PSA was widely successful. Subjects who read that the message had been successful generally believed that the source, the message itself, and the channel through which the message was delivered were all more responsible for that success, but that the receiver of the message was not an influential factor in said success. That is, when subjects believed that others had been persuaded to become organ donors, they were more likely to say that they had also been persuaded. Relating this back to the vaccine PSAs and other types of YouTube PSAs, if viewers think YouTube videos are very persuasive on not just being seen by others, but being believed by others, as they apparently are, then logically, they are more likely to in turn be persuaded and influenced by the messages of that PSA. So for people who see these kinds of videos go viral, they can tend to believe that others are being influenced by these videos due to their virality, and in turn be themselves more influenced by the message regardless of how utterly insufferable the message format is. To reiterate, people think YouTube videos are more persuasive than TV PSAs, and when they think others are being persuaded by those videos, as we know they do, they are more likely to be prone to be persuaded themselves. So, just how persuasive are viral videos when they concern the topic which has spawned so many of them over the last year? If you want to make a viral media post encouraging others to get vaccinated, for instance, how might you do so most efficaciously, so that rather than create a visceral cringe response, you encourage actual behavioral change? Lunge-Turillo et al. 2020 sought to understand vaccine hesitancy and what kinds of messages were more likely to be effective at encouraging others to get the MMR vaccine, which protects against measles, mumps, and rubella. They suggested 3 psychological aspects which were correlated to this type of hesitancy: needle and blood sensitivity, in that some people are just afraid of the action itself; moral purity, which is a moral foundation that suggests that some people are predisposed to be concerned with things they find disgusting or as a violation of their own bodily autonomy; and need for cognitive closure, which is a desire in some people to have a definitive answer, any answer, about the long-term effects of medicines. Because people high in need for cognitive closure are looking for answers, they may be uniquely prone to adopt misinformation because, again, they're looking for any answer to their medical question. In this study, then, the researchers asked subjects about their endorsement of medical misinformation regarding the MMR vaccine and autism, their fear of having blood drawn or of injections, their level of purity based on moral foundations, and their need for cognitive closure. Subjects read one of 5 articles, one which emphasized that vaccines were safe, one relating them to autism, one which focused on the seriousness of the measles, one which suggested needles would no longer be necessary in the near future, and one control article about language development in children. As predicted, those with a fear of needles were more likely to say that they believed in conspiracies about MMR, as were those high in the purity foundation. However, this was not the case for those with a need for closure, and instead, need for closure was negatively related to disinformation. That is, people who want to know more about vaccines are generally not likely to spread or believe misinformation, and instead they may just be hesitant on their own without any attempts to influence others. Women, Black people, and Hispanic people were all more likely to endorse disinformation, as were Republicans, although Republicans only to a minor degree. It is a bit hard to believe that Republicans are less likely to spread disinfo than are women, considering the GOP continues to deny my Freedom of Information requests for more information about Ted Cruz's background in cryptography. There was a negative relationship between moral purity and likelihood to believe information about MMR when subjects read the article about the measles. However, this was reversed and far stronger in those high in moral purity and inaccurate information for those who read the article about vaccines and autism. In that, while the likelihood of misinformation endorsement was about 5% for those lowest in moral purity, it was almost 20% for those highest in moral purity. After reading an article about how vaccines do not cause autism, those high in moral purity were actually more likely to endorse the belief that vaccines were linked to autism. Similarly, those seriously afraid of needles who read about a potential needleless treatment in the near future were less likely to endorse misinformation. Comparatively to those who read the no needle article, in the control condition, those lowest in needle sensitivity had about a 5% probability of endorsing anti-vaccine misinformation, and that rose to 20% for those highest in needle sensitivity. while less than 10% of those sensitive to needles endorsed misinformation when they read about the potential for needleless vaccines. Once again, the need for cognitive closure was negatively related to a tendency to believe medical misinformation unilaterally. Applying these data to the current crisis would suggest that people who tend to actually be more concerned and need cognitive closure are less likely to endorse disinformation. But that does not mean that those people are more likely to get a vaccine that they distrust, because they lack cognitive closure. Instead, much as with the Bogner et al. Study, it may be that people who want cognitive closure may be less likely to get a vaccine that lacks said closure, yet also would be unlikely to express such opinions publicly. That is, it may be that a lot of the people who do not want to get vaccinated against the coup are actually those who are doing so because of a lack of cognitive closure, but it would be difficult to isolate this group because they don't tend to talk about it. In turn, people who are openly afraid of vaccines are those worried about purity concerns or about needles. For all three of these types, however, as seen in the reactions to the article read, it was only articles that emphasized a no-needle solution or the necessity of the MMR vaccine that had any effect on reducing vaccine hesitancy in the form of misinformation adoption. The article that emphasized the safety of vaccines did nothing to influence those high in need for cognitive closure, nor for those who were concerned with moral purity. Focusing on the safety of vaccines was actually related to increased promotion of misinformation in those who were afraid of needles. That is, when people who were afraid of needles were reminded of how safe the MMR vaccine was, they were actually more likely to believe disinformation about the vaccine. This kind of seems to indicate that people who are more skeptical tend to be more willing to get a vaccination when they are given medical evidence of its efficacy than are people who are just afraid of needles or who have purity concerns about vaccines. By the way, all three types of concerns were positively correlated, albeit minorly, with being a Republican, which might explain the current behavior of some conservatives, either being afraid of needles, having purity concerns, or simply needing more information. In toto, however, fear messages can be persuasive on those with purity concerns, but it seems not so much for those afraid of needles, while those who need cognitive closure are not easily affected by any media messages, fearful or otherwise. And that makes sense when we look to a study specifically about medical students who were hesitant to get the vaccine, perhaps precisely because they lacked cognitive closure, as seen in a study from Lucia, Keklar, and Alfonso 2020. Medical students from Southeast Michigan were asked a series of questions about vaccines in general and the COVID-19 vaccinations that were still being developed at the time of data collection. Generally, the students were very positive towards vaccines, with 99.5% saying vaccines are important both for their career as a physician and their own personal health. But when looking at COVID in particular, 98.9% reported that the development of a vaccine was important to decrease the spread and for public health. 86% of students believed that vaccines against the COV should be mandatory for healthcare professionals, and 68% agreed that vaccines should also be similarly mandatory for the general public. So clearly these medical students, people who know a lot more about medicine than most of us, have a lot of faith in vaccines, and should be able to assuage the fears of those who are hesitant by getting it and supporting the vaccines themselves, right? Well, maybe again it's due to the lack of cognitive closure, because when asked about their personal views, things were a little bit different. While more than 98% believed they were likely to be exposed to the virus and thought vaccination was important for them as a healthcare provider, only 53% said they would be willing to participate in a vaccine trial, and 77% said they were concerned about the effectiveness of the vaccine. Additionally, more than half, 55%, were concerned about the serious side effects it could pose, and 94.5% said they needed more information. Again indicating that some of these concerns may be due to a lack of cognitive closure, although 87% reported that they trusted the information that they were receiving. Despite the fact that almost all medical students, 98 to 99%, espoused the importance of vaccination for medical professionals, and 68% believed that vaccination should be mandatory for the general public, 15% of that exact same sample said they would only get the COV vaccine if required by their health system or medical school. I'm not saying it sounds like not all of these medical professionals don't want to go first, but it kind of sounds like some of them don't want to go first.
You will be the all-important first attack wave, which we will call Operation Human Shield. Hey, wait a minute!
In terms of individual differences between students who reported being hesitant and not hesitant, there were a few. While 3% of both groups had personally had the coof and 11% of both groups had cared for someone with the infection, the vaccine-hesitant group was less likely to have personally known someone who had been infected with or passed from the virus. The hesitant group was minorly more likely, 14% versus 10%, to say they had previously delayed getting a vaccine. Yet 100% of both groups said they would get a flu vaccine for the 2020 to 2021 flu season. So clearly neither groups of students were opposed to vaccinations, and instead see this particular vaccine as the exception, not the rule. But before you go to type your comment about how that 15% of medical students must have been crazy Trump supporters, when asked to give open-ended explanations as to why there was vaccine hesitancy in regard to these specific vaccines, several reported that they believed that hesitancy arose from the rapidity at which the trials were being conducted in general, but specifically under Trump, with one subject saying specifically, quote, "Many people do not trust the CDC and the FDA because President Trump might be pressuring these institutions to rush out a vaccine for his own political gain. Thus, while it's not just possible, but likely, that the reason why many people experience vaccine hesitancy is because they don't know anything about medicines or vaccines, it seems then also that some people who know a lot about medicines and vaccines, but feel like they don't have enough information and still have some need for cognitive closure, such as medical students, may also be hesitant. And while 15% of medical students saying they wouldn't get vaccinated unless forced to doesn't sound like a lot, remember that those are the ones who were willing to admit to their beliefs to a researcher about this very sensitive topic. And survey effects like social desirability, which we'll talk about later, may actually mean that percentage is higher than reported, considering that almost 100% of those same students emphasized the importance of getting the vaccine they themselves were hesitant towards. It seems then that both knowledge and personal beliefs play an important role in how fears influence our behaviors, but what about self-concept and self-esteem?
Hell yeah! I have the power of God!
These findings were mirrored in more recent data from King et al. 2021, who examined vaccine hesitancy in US adults, and these data were broken down into several demographic categories to better understand who is more or less likely to report that they were unwilling to get the COOF vaccine. Those with less than a high school level education were less willing to get vaccinated than those with any level of college or professional education, except for those who held a PhD, who were more hesitant than those with less than a high school level diploma. When age and race were adjusted for, however, this effect was diminished, but still reflective of the same kind of trends, in that people with advanced degrees, such as master's or juris doctorates, were less vaccine hesitant than those with doctoral level degrees, whose level of hesitancy, even when accounting for other demographic variables, was more similar to those with only some collegiate experience than those who held a master's degree. Do these variables make one behave differently when faced to a threat to one's well-being? Self-esteem in relationship to the COOF was discussed in an article from Pajitsky et al. 2021. That's Pajitsky, not Pajitsky. The shart break kid, the shard of darkness herself.
I farted, and then a little wet came and I wasn't wearing any underwear under my pajamas.
Who know that the effects of terror management and mortality salience on behavior are influenced by 3 anti-anxiety buffering factors: self-esteem striving, cultural worldview defense, or affirming close relationships. That is, higher self-esteem and having close personal relationships may reduce the effects of mortality salience as well as cultural worldview defense, which are shared beliefs about reality that provide answers to basic questions about life, such as religion or cultural immortality via one's actions. In relationship to terror management, self-esteem relates to cultural worldview defense when one believes that he or she is living up to the standards or superseding the standards expected of individuals within one's own culture. In return, close relationships serve as a form of validation, both of one's worldview and self-esteem needed to maintain confidence in them, as well as providing security in their own right. Thus, all 3 aspects are related to how we react to health crises and messaging associated with that crisis. Pajitsky et al. Note 3 of these buffering elements were threatened under the COVID pandemic, with people being socially isolate from one another, disallowing some forms of close relationships, self-esteem similarly being negatively affected by isolation, and cultural worldview defense being diminished by the loss of jobs and income. falling stock market values, or general economic chaos. Thus, the current public health crisis presents a potentially very unique ability to influence behaviors in relationship to terror management self-esteem, which might otherwise serve as a bolstering agent against mortality salience effects. Because so many of these PSAs about COVID are related to getting vaccinated against the disease, we should understand how that potential decrease in self-esteem and other variables identified by Pajinski could affect behavior or beliefs regarding the jab, and we can do that by looking to a study from Bogner et al. 2021 and a survey of Israeli participants. Israel is a unique case because they have had a high vaccination rate compared to many other nations, with 80% of adults having been vaccinated as of June of 2021. Thus, if we can understand how terror management influences the citizens of Israel, we can get a good idea of how effects like terror management influence one of the countries that has been most effective at administering the jab. Jewish Israelis were surveyed on their perceived nearness to death, their anxiety about death, their vaccination anxiety, their existing medical conditions, potential exposure to the COOF, general attitudes towards vaccines, and whether or not they had gotten the jab. Those who believed they were more near to death had understandably more anxiety and were older, but also more anxiety about getting the vaccine, believed they were more likely to have been exposed to COVID but also possessed fewer comorbid health conditions that make the COOF particularly dangerous. Those who experienced anxiety about the COOF jab in particular were more likely to be female and younger, and had more negative opinions about vaccines in general and be less likely to have been vaccinated. COOF vaccine anxiety was moderately related to both fear of death and belief that death was near. When asked specifically why they were anxious about getting vaccinated, 7 different responses accounted for 64% of the variance in anxiety. Lower levels of anxiety were related to fears about immune response, concerns about mutations, negative side effects, or a general lack of knowledge about vaccines, while the top 3 concerns that led to more anxiety were issues with the expediency and the approval of the vaccines, a belief that the vaccines may be dangerous, and a fear of long-term damage. In terms of terror management, it is important to note that those who were most afraid, and generally seem to be more afraid for rational reasons, are also less likely to be willing to get the jab. Going back to PSAs, it makes sense then for the majority of them to focus on the social aspects and not the health aspects, because as seen here in these data, the social repercussions of taking the vaccine were not among any of the reasons that people said they were concerned with it. And if anyone knows how to convince people how to not smoke using creative PSAs, because smoking is cringe, it's the Israelis.
Vape Nation on the news, represent the nation, y'all.
In previous studies looking at smoking or binge drinking PSAs, messages that emphasized ostracization were generally more effective, likely because they help reduce mortality salience and death thought accessibility. And that's a really good tactic if you want people to change their behaviors regarding something that would otherwise scare them. So then we need to further understand how fearful messages specifically are related to the issue of the COOF, and we can do that by looking to a study from Lada et al. 2021, who examined responses to 3 different types of health messages, those being personal health risks, economic costs, and collective public health consequences of behavior. Subjects read one of 3 articles about COVID, one which emphasized personal health risks, another which emphasized economic risks, and a third which emphasized collective health risks. The article was either depicted as being written by a layperson who had suffered from the virus or by a medical professional. Some of these articles were pre-bunked, including a preface that was intended to assuage the fears of the rapid nature of the vaccine's development by assuring readers of the vaccine's safety, while others included no such statement. While these scholars refer to this tactic as pre-bunking, it's a similar tactic to that of inoculation theory, in that it provides the subject with a weakened form of the counter-argument and defeats that argument, much as a vaccine often contains a weakened form of a virus, or a straw man. In the articles from the layperson perspective, subjects read about the experiences of supposedly average people who had had the COOF, or in the collective health condition, the concerns of a regular person with leukemia, all encouraging the subject to get vaccinated, while the articles from the medical perspective were less emotive and more clinical. The control group instead read an article about the history of baseball.
Look, I tried to tell you, you're on a space station in the 24th century. The only ball field around is a holographic simulation. It's not real, and neither are you.
Those who read the pre-bunked statement were slightly less likely to report intentions to get vaccinated than those that did not. There was no difference in intention to vaccinate based on the source, however, meaning that the personal, emotional story was just as persuasive as the data-based report from a medical professional. Fears of economic loss due to a lack of vaccinations was the least compelling argument, followed by collective health, which was more effective, and with personal health being the most effective message at encouraging people to get vaccinated. Political partisanship was unrelated to intentions to get the poke. All treatments had limited effects in intentions to vaccinate in those who reported already being skeptical, indicating that people have probably already made up their minds, and persuasive messages are unlikely to change that. The only significant influential message for skeptics was that which pre-bunked arguments about a lack of scientific rigor, emphasized the collective health risk to society, and originated from a layperson, not a doctor. In other words, if you want to convince people who have already made up their minds against the jab that it is really in their best interest, one should craft a message such that it comes from a non-official, quote, regular person source, that it emphasizes keeping others safe rather than personal safety, which again makes sense as thinking about personal safety can trigger feelings of mortality salience and terror management, and preempts counter-arguments with explanations. In that way, it's possible that these cringy musicals are actually somewhat effective in influencing some people's behavior because so few of them focus on personal health and instead focus on social responsibility, by mentioning things like return to travel and normalcy, and coming from regular people rather than medical professionals. And again, that all makes a lot of sense given what we know about mortality salience and terror management. People don't want to be scared by doctors. They want to be encouraged positively by lay people, or put more eloquently by ICP.
And I don't want to talk to a scientist. Y'all motherfuckers lying and getting me pissed.
Great, more riddles.
Another aspect about these PSAs, or whatever you want to call them, is that for as cringy as they may be, they are also pretty much unquestionably a little bit creative. These people obviously spent a lot of time writing these lyrics and creating these videos, so could the creativity of these kinds of projects in and of themselves be persuasive? Well, research from Coy et al. 2020 seemed to indicate maybe. In their first experiment, subjects first read a short news report, one which evoked mortality salience by describing the number of people who had passed as a result of the coof, and another which did not evoke mortality salience and instead reported on how the pandemic was negatively affecting tourism. Next, participants completed either a benevolent or malevolent creative task. The benevolent task asked subjects to pretend that they were an administrator of a non-profit organization and to come up with creative ways to raise money for the non-profit as quickly as possible so that the group could complete its ongoing projects. In turn, the malevolent task asked subjects to imagine that they were in a position of authority in a for-profit company that was in fierce competition with another company for the same customer pool. Participants further read that they had recently learned that the head of the competitor company was a former alcoholic and were asked to come up with a creative way to smear the competitor using that information without letting the public know that their company had leaked said information. Respondents' levels of anxiety were measured after completing the creative task. Those who engaged in the benevolent creative action and had read the mortality salient article reported significantly lower levels of anxiety than those who read the article that did not induce mortality salience. The opposite was the case for the malevolent creative task, as those who read the mortality salient article were more anxious than those who read the article that did not induce mortality salience. In other words, people engaged in some positive creative activity when thinking about something that could be scary were less anxious than those who engaged in malicious creative activity. Applying these findings to PSAs could indicate that watching something creative and positive, even when in the presence of a concept that evokes thoughts of mortality, may reduce the anxieties of viewers as well as the creators of the project. To further understand these relationships, in a second experiment, subjects were given the same benevolent and malevolent creative tasks as in the first study. This time, mortality salience was introduced by asking subjects to either write down their thoughts about what it might be like to die, while the control group was asked to write about dental pain. Participants were also asked to write about how important finding meaning in their life was. Hierarchical regression analysis indicated that, once again, benevolent creativity was related to decreased anxiety in response to mortality salience, but not equally in all people. Those who expressed a higher desire for meaning-making felt less anxiety when exposed to the mortality salient prompt. From this study, along with the previous experiment, we could surmise that creativity serves as a buffer for the anxiety produced by mortality salience. And while these researchers looked specifically at engaging in creative activity, watching creative works could also reduce anxiety associated with mortality salience in general, and specifically as it relates to the coof, perhaps uniquely in those who are looking for greater meaning in their life. But that's a bit of a stretch to assume. Instead, it probably did make a lot of the people who produced these videos or worked on them feel a little bit less anxious to pour their energy that they might otherwise have spent worrying into making something creative, even if it's cringe. Probably the most important thing to understand about these PSAs is whether or not they actually change behaviors, and if not behaviors, then at least beliefs as it pertains to the coof, which was studied by Jin et al. 2021 in a sample of Pakistani participants. Subjects were assigned to one of 4 experimental groups. Group 1 was exposed to physical media messages in a newspaper, in which the World Health Organization exclaimed the safety of all COVID vaccines. Group 2 saw the same message but presented in an online format. Group 3 was associated with newspaper messages that emphasized fear associated with the coof, while Group 4 saw the same message as Group 3 but presented in an online format. Subjects perceived the threat to the coof, their vaccine efficacy, that is, belief that getting the vaccine would be easy, the perceived benefits of getting vaccinated, skepticism towards the vaccine, and willingness to get vaccinated were all measured. For those who read the newspaper PSA that emphasized safety, their perceived threat of the virus was related to greater perceived benefits of vaccination, self-efficacy towards getting vaccinated, and were more willing to get vaccinated than those who read the same article that emphasized safety in a digital format. In turn, skepticism towards vaccines was lower in those who read the print article than those who read the same article online. Skepticism was lower in general in relationship to other variables for those who read the print ad. For both print and online media, perceived benefits were equally related to willingness to get vaccinated. Skepticism towards vaccines was only related to decreased willingness in readers of the online article that emphasized safety. This could be because there is still some perception among people that print media is more trustworthy than internet media, which of course we all know is untrue since Weekly World News stopped printing new issues. Results were similar for those who had read the online and physical PSAs that utilized messages focusing on fear. As with media focused on benefits, perceived threat of the coof when the media message was fearful was related more strongly to increased perceived benefits of vaccination, self-efficacy towards getting vaccinated, and a greater willingness to get vaccinated when the message came from a print source rather than an online source. Skepticism was unrelated to willingness to get the jab for those who read both types of articles designed to scare readers. Looking to moderator variables, the direct effect of skepticism towards COVID-19 vaccinations and the willingness to vaccinate was negative and significant in all conditions. In toto then, subjects who believed in greater severity of infection, perceived susceptibility, and perceived benefits of vaccination were, unsurprisingly, more willing to get vaccinated. Further, fear-inducing messages framed as a PSA were most effective in influencing self-efficacy, the belief that one can do something about that fear by getting the jab. In turn, more positive messages mostly just increased perceptions of the benefits, and through benefits, that belief increased willingness to vaccinate. Thus, it seems that there are just some types of fearful messages that will be effective at changing behavior, but also that there are types of more positive, pro-social health messages that can encourage behavioral alteration as well. Although overwhelmingly, it seems from this specific dataset that fear is potentially more influential at increasing willingness to get the vaccine rather than positive messages, except in those highly skeptical who are uninfluenced by either valence of the message, positive or terrifying. But regardless of whether or not the positive messages are efficacious, what these PSAs coming from lay people trying not to scare others are doing then is encouraging pro-social behavior in the form of promoting vaccinations in those who might otherwise be reticent. But why are they doing it? Are they making these TikToks and these YouTube videos out of the kindness of their hearts, or because they want to go viral and make money? How are the messages that encourage altruism influenced by the various social circumstances surrounding the coof? I'm sure many of the people behind these types of attempts at virality, for the most part, had good intentions in making them, sincerely wanting to perform some kind of public service. I mean, even the "We'll convert your children" PSA ultimately has a message of acceptance, although they managed to express that message in one of the creepiest ways possible by designing it specifically to piss off middle American parents and subsequently, well, pissed off middle American parents, and not in the endearing way that John Waters did, all apparently to the great shock of the creators. But for the vaccine PSAs, surely most of the people involved think making these messages is a benefit for public health, right? But do the data actually support that supposition? Well, maybe. Over the course of the pandemic, we've seen both increases in selfish and altruistic behavior. On the selfish side of things, particularly early on, a lot of areas saw shortages of toilet paper and other necessities due to panic buying, which, although perhaps made sense in the minds of people expecting the worst, is a greedy behavior. On the more selfless side of things, for example, celebrities like Michael Douglas, Gwyneth Paltrow, Reese Witherspoon all donated to the Frontline Responders Fund and America's Food Fund, while Katy Perry donated 10% of the sales from her fashion brands to Baby, a non-profit organization to help provide essential items to children and families impacted by COVID-19, which I suppose you could all consider selfless, although let's be real, these donations were really more public relations than they were selfless social responsibility, and most importantly, tax write-offs.
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS? No, thank you.
But in terms of more realistic and honest altruism, we also saw stories like this one, wherein medical students at the University of Louisville and University of Cincinnati, UC sucks by the way, go Musketeers, whose studies were put on hold due to the pandemic, were assigned to work with a person at high risk in the community by doing grocery shopping, picking up prescriptions, delivering food boxes from food banks, or performing other errands for homebound seniors. So while there are stories of hoarding and panic buying that may have been more mainstream news, there have also been very real-world examples of selflessness arising from problems produced by the COOF. While not specifically looking at PSAs, but more general altruism during COVID, a study from Jin and Ryu 2021 sought to see if people became more selfish or selfless over the course of the 2020 crisis, while mortality was particularly salient for many people. Subjects' level of general fear, death anxiety, and death thought accessibility were measured. Subjects were then asked several questions about their willingness to donate, including the actual amount of money that they were willing to donate, the ratio of their own funds they were willing to donate to others versus spending on themselves, the amount of time they would be willing to spend volunteering, and the monetary value they placed on their own time. Death thought accessibility, so again the degree to which one is prone to think about death-related ideas, was related to fear and death anxiety, but unrelated to all other variables. Fear was minorly positively correlated to materialism, but much more strongly positively correlated to powerlessness, while death anxiety was related to minor degrees to both materialism and powerlessness, but more so to materialism. In turn, materialism and powerlessness were related to minor degrees to every aforementioned variable, including the amount of money donated, time spent volunteering, and the perception of the economic value of one's time. Levels of fear were positively related to powerlessness, materialism, willingness to donate, the percentage of their own money subjects were willing to donate, time spent volunteering, perceived value of time, value placed on one's time, and socioeconomic status, while fear was negatively related to income. Death anxiety was similarly positively related to all variables except income. It seems then that when people are afraid, they actually tend to be more pro-social, but this pro-sociality is mediated through feelings of materialism and a sense of helplessness. These prompts didn't have to scare anyone though, and instead, the results are indicative that people who are just generally thinking about death more tend to be more concerned with helping others through charity, and that is based in part on a feeling that perhaps things would be hopeless if not for individual involvement. But that first study was just looking at death thought accessibility and fear and anxiety in general, not specifically how those variables were influenced by the COOF. In a second study then, some subjects first watched a video about COVID-19. Others watched a mortality salient video about the COOF, while still others watched no video. Their fear, death anxiety, and death thought accessibility and powerlessness were all measured. As before, subjects were asked to think about a charity and their willingness to donate time and money, anticipated happiness and anticipation of a sense of power accrued were they to donate to that charity, their general mood state, the value placed on material goods, personal need for status, and systems justification. Systems justification is a belief that people's status in the world is a product of their own actions, not the system itself. General narcissism, selfishness, materialism, greed and status consumption, the belief that high-status items like Gucci or Prada are appealing, were all measured as well. Those who watched the video about COVID were much more afraid than the control, possessed more death thought anxiety and death thought accessibility, more powerlessness, were more aroused, and not in a fun way I would imagine, were more willing to spend more time volunteering, but also viewed the value of their time as much higher than the control, felt slightly more happiness when thinking about donating, but also felt a much greater sense of personal power, reported being more involved in charity, but also considerably more materialistic, and possessed a greater need for social status, and finally were higher in systems justification, meaning they were more likely to essentially believe that people kind of get what they deserve. There's a lot we could take away from that list of variables, but what the totality of findings here seem to indicate is that when people have been made afraid because of the coof, they seemingly have a need to want to stabilize the world, such as to fix it, sure, but also it seems that they want to divert their own attention and maybe want rewards for their own behavior. They want to donate, they want to volunteer, sure, but they also want material goods. They want to be seen as popular, and they seemingly are more likely to think that if something bad happens to someone in society, well, that person probably freaking deserved it. If this sounds like a lot of people who are scared of the coof might believe that a way to ameliorate that fear is through activism, and along with that increased desire to engage in activism is seemingly a desire to be rewarded for said activism, and thus the whole thing is all a bunch of getting high on your own supply, well, that's kind of how it comes off to me. When people are afraid, obviously we want to reduce that fear and make ourselves feel better, but it seems that at least in the context of the coof, this need to feel better, while it might produce pro-social outcomes and behaviors, is accompanied by a desire to be rewarded with material goods and popularity. When we look back to some of these cringy viral videos, they're not entirely doing this for social welfare, whether they say that out loud or not. They expect recompense for their activism. They're doing it for social capital, or at least many are, if not all. Subjects who watched the video about COVID reported that they would be more willing to donate more money than those who watched no such video and whose mortality was not evoked. And when we look back at the total data output, we're more willing to spend proportionally more time on others than the self compared to the control, but not by a whole lot. When powerlessness was entered into the model in this second study, again as a mediator, charitable donations produced a significant effect on exposure to the COVID video, along with a greater desire to give monetary donations, volunteer more time, and possess greater perceived value of time through perceptions of powerlessness. Utilizing regression analysis to determine causal relationships, and seen here in this big bunch of graphs, the ultimate finding of this second study is this. The greedier, more selfish, narcissistic, materialistic, and systems justifying the person, the more money and time they said they would be willing to donate to charitable causes, but only when they had watched a video about the coof and were fearing for their own lives. It seems then that people who have been exposed to information about COVID, which we know is likely to scare a lot of people and potentially make mortality salient, while they may be more willing to help society in some ways through donations or money, the people most likely to get involved themselves in these kinds of pro-social behaviors are people who probably think they're going to get something back in return, be it money or attention or goods, all while thinking that bad things happen to bad people. If you've ever wanted to understand the psychology of this particular TikTok video,
I'm not gonna get the vaccine. Then die. What do we do, argue with you? I'm not on the debate team, this isn't mock trial.
Well, I think this is the answer. It's important to note that in both of these studies, subjects never actually gave a penny, nor a second of their time to any charity. They were just reporting on how much they said they would be willing to give, while being asked by a researcher. It was all performance of behavior they believed was socially desirable. And there's already an existing problem in social science research in that surveys have a social desirability bias. Social desirability is a tendency within the social sciences for subjects to over-report, quote, good behavior in order to portray themselves as more culturally and socially acceptable of a person. In other words, respondents in these studies will sometimes report beliefs or intentions that they themselves don't really hold, merely because they know that those beliefs or intentions are socially desirable. A meta-analysis from Lee and Sargent 2011, for example, found that up to 65% of their sample reported that they gave more money to charities than they were actually willing to give, with the highest degree of underreporting of charitable donations, so people giving more than they reported being willing to give, maxed out at £50, while the highest degree of over-reporting maxing out at £385. In other words, people can really tend to over-report how much they are willing to donate under the influence of the bias of social desirability. But while social desirability may explain some of these findings, clearly it doesn't explain all of them. The rest of the variants here could indicate that people who tend to virtue signal to researchers and say they would engage in more charitable behavior under the context of the coof are really the biggest assholes in any given situation. And I mean, looking at some of the PSAs and some of people's behavior, that certainly seems likely. Particularly if we expand beyond the coof and look at the number of people involved in the We'll Convert Your Children video who have been accused, albeit with not great evidence, of being registered sex offenders. But I digress. There is a third option, however, something I will call the Scrooge Effect, in that it may be that when people are feeling as if their mortality is salient and their life is at risk, they may suddenly have a desire to give to charity, particularly when they have personally been a greedy, selfish, narcissistic dick.
The Jews taught me this great word. Schmuck. I was a schmuck.
However, there is a reason I'm prone to believe that these results are due to the first option, the virtue signaling option, and that's because of the other related variable, systems justification. That is, people who say that they are willing to donate to charity when they have been reminded of COVID and its potential evocation of mortality salience were not just people who were very self-centered, but people who believe that when bad things happen to others, it's because they deserved it. Doesn't sound like the personality profile of someone who really cares about people's personal suffering. It sounds to me like someone who really wants money and attention. And honestly, I think that probably describes a lot of people, at least in charge of cringy, insufferable attempts at virality in the various vaccine videos. People who don't really care but want to look like they care, and in reality are probably selfish, narcissistic materialists who think that if you get sick, well then you freaking deserved it. And I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with the specific people who made these videos that we've been analyzing, but if you want a perfect exemplar, besides this guy, then just look to the response from people who have been, I'm guessing, in favor of vaccines and lockdowns towards information that Steven Crowder suffered from a collapsed lung. Yeah, the same people who supposedly care so much about your health suddenly find this hilarious. And I think that this study really explains everything that we're looking at here. Narcissism and selfishness. Only pretending to care about public health while really probably hoping that the people they don't like face serious, life-threatening consequences. And by consequences, again, I'll let our friend explain.
Then die.
So with all of that in mind, let's come to a few conclusions. Today, we've examined whether or not PSAs are actually influencing behaviors, and the answer seems to be probably not. Whether it be an egg on a frying pan or a child on train tracks, people generally don't listen to PSAs precisely because they tend to scare us. While positive and uplifting PSAs may be more effective, the degree to which they persuade is questionable. Generally speaking, media messages aren't great at changing attitudes, which is perhaps in part why internet PSAs and PSAs in general are seen as so hilarious and cringy by many, despite the oft best intentions of their creators. However, do the creators of these coof PSAs really have your health in mind? Or are they more concerned with their own wealth and bank accounts? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and leaving a comment to feed that algorithm. I want to give an enormous shout out and thank you to my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. You guys are the absolute best, and you allow me to make videos like this that, I mean, let's be real, are unlikely to be monetized and certainly are not going to be promoted by their algorithm. Thank you guys so much. If you want to help me out, consider becoming a patron or joining on Subscribestar to see your name listed here, or buying some merch from my merch store. I also want to thank my sponsor, The Morning Brew, which you can check out again, linked down below in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.